Welcome to Biology B, our first virtual session. We are going to look at a PowerPoint here that I've made and go through a few things. I am going to go ahead and mute people just in case you're not muted. Let's see. Everyone's muted. Okay. If you want to talk, you can just unmute yourself, but that way you can hear me better and there's less noise going on. So we're going to talk about a couple of things today. The first thing is we're going to talk about expectations of the course, and we're going to talk about some upcoming stuff here. And then we're going to talk about major pieces of evidence for evolution. So first thing is on Valentine's Day, we're having a natural selection lab. It is different than the natural selection lab that's in the course. I wrote it, so it's 1,000 times better than the one in the course, I personally think. But if you had a hard time understanding that lab, rightly so, because the directions are a little bit confusing and the process is a little bit weird, then I'm actually going to explain that lab after this virtual session, so you can hang around. Or if you're watching the recorded version, you can fast forward here to the end, and I'm going to review that course lab. On Valentine's Day, we're going to be doing a lab with Skittles. We're going to be acting as a starfish, eating different types of mussels. And then we will eat the Skittles after, if you want to. Although maybe not the ones you touch. But maybe you don't care about that. I don't know. All right. So first, and as a reminder, well, I'll explain that here, I guess. So course expectations and helpful reminders. So we have a lot of new people to the course. We have 71 people enrolled in this course at this time, which is a lot. So I'm going to do my best to try to, respond to everyone and grade as quickly as possible. But it's almost twice what we had last time. So keep in mind, I've got to mute some people again. Keep in mind that, maybe it's just me that I hear. Oops. Keep in mind that you only have to do one collaboration assignment for the entire semester. So it says that when you read about them, but it's just kind of like, yeah, you only have to do one. It doesn't really explain. So I'm telling you now, right? You only have to do one project. There's one offered in each module.
One collaboration assignment.
Yep, just one. So there is one offered in each module.
Down here is the chat box.
I would actually go through them maybe and look at the topic, look at how much work it's going to be, and decide which one is most interesting to you. Some of them are easier than others. Some of them are also more fun, right? So keep that in mind. If the first project comes up and you're like, this doesn't sound like I want to do it, then fine, skip it. You can come back and do that one, right? Basically, all I'm going to do is grade one of them, and then I excuse the other two. So it doesn't count against you at all. To schedule a DBA, you're going to want to contact me via email or text, right? My schedule changes a lot. I also teach group fitness classes, so I'm randomly teaching at all times. So make sure to just send me a text or an email. Hey, can I call you right now? Can I call you tomorrow? And then I'll do my best to be available for you. And then for the tests, so I set it up so that you only have one attempt on test, just because there's not an infinite number of questions available. So I don't want people to keep retaking it and then see the answers to everything, right? So if you take a test and you do really poorly, just contact me, right? If you can show me some notes, then I'll give you another attempt and you can retake the test. That does not count for the final test at the end of the semester, right? I'm not going to give retakes on that one. So make sure you're ready before you take that test. We'll talk more about that much later in the semester. Labs can be attended virtually or in person, right? They always occur on Tuesdays at noon at MIWA. You can attend virtually or you can attend in person. It's more fun in person because you actually get to play with materials. But virtually, you're going to get to see the process as well. So try to make at least one of them in person if you can. All right, I changed the breakdown of the grade. So I didn't realize that last semester they actually, someone can't hear anything that I'm saying. That's not good. Can everyone else hear me okay? Okay. Everyone else can, let's see. Give me 1 second, guys. Let's solve this. Okay. So, whoops. So I changed the grade breakdown a little bit because last time it had that the segment exam was 20% of your grade and then everything else was 80% of your grade, which technically means that you could do nothing all semester, do really well on the exam, and then just that's it. So I try to make it a little more even, especially too if you're not super good at tests, right? We don't want that completely ruining your grade at the end. So assignments, reflections, and labs, which is going to be most of the stuff we do, is going to be 50% of your grade. Tests and projects, that's just the one collaboration project that you choose. And the module tests and the segment exam, that's going to be 40% of your grade. And then the DBAs are going to be 10% of your grade. So if you never do a DBA with me, then you're still going to be fine. Keep in mind, there are alternatives. If you don't want to talk to me, we can work something out. Also, I've had a few people who actually did all of their DBAs at the end of the semester. That's perfectly fine. All right. So on to the content part here. Evolution. Uh-oh, I'm echoing. Okay. So we talked in the last virtual session, one of the last ones for Biology A, a little bit about this, right? That I said, come in with an open mind, right? This isn't supposed to be something that's changing your thinking about something or influencing your beliefs necessarily. But I do want you to know what it is. So this is a little summary of it, right? It's a slow change of organisms over time. Now, there's different variations of that theory. There's some scientists who say there's mostly slow change, and then there's pockets of really quick change, and then slow change again. You know, and there's different models for how that might look, but the concept here is that it's slow, right? You're not going to be looking outside and see something evolve, right? That's not going to happen. There's no goal for evolution, right? It did not set out to create humans. So there's not a goal. We don't know where it's going to go next, right? And it's almost impossible to predict that. It's a response to changes in the environment, right? So as the environment changes and certain mutations are more favorable, those organisms are more likely to survive. And then this process that controls evolution is called natural selection. And that is a pretty complicated process in itself. And that's kind of what you were trying to mimic during that natural selection lab with the colored pieces of paper. So we'll talk about that and why it's actually hard to mimic that. It's almost impossible to do it. All right. Oh, and keep in mind, this is a theory, right? Because there's tons of evidence supporting it. But like I said, it's pretty hard to actually observe happening. So that's been something that's been hard for scientists to grasp. But we've actually been able to recently observe evolution in bacteria, right? Because bacteria reproduce really quickly. They produce thousands of offspring, and you know, they can just keep reproducing every single day. And they do have mutations and they do have slight genes that change, right? A lot of them are becoming resistant to antibiotics. And that's a type of evolution here, where now we have these superbugs where every antibiotic doesn't do anything, right? Which is scary because bacterial infections are something that used to kill people really easily, right? Strep throat, you could die from. Pneumonia, you could die from. Tuberculosis, you could die from. There are all these horrible diseases that now you just get antibiotics, right? And in like 3 days, you're good to go. You're back at school. you're doing your job, you're doing whatever, and you're fine. And that's starting to not work so well anymore. These bacteria, they have actually adapted to the environment. They're able to resist the antibiotics now. They're able to survive and reproduce and, essentially kill people, which is pretty intense. So, that's something that we have recently observed, which I think is going to influence people's ideas of evolution and how it works. That's pretty cool to be like in that time. All right, so the pieces of evidence. I just wanted to go through them because they're a little confusing, some of them, and some of them are kind of obvious, but it's always nice. I think you guys like to hear me talk about the content, so I'm going to talk about it. So our first piece of evidence is paleontology, right, which just means fossils. So sometimes you'll see a chart like this where we're actually looking at how long ago fossils of these types of animals were found in rocks, right? So we have the Cambrian era, which is like one of the oldest periods of time on Earth. And then we have the most recent one, the Quaternary era, right? And then we have some that you guys probably recognize, Jurassic, Triassic, right? Dinosaurs were living there. So really what we see this change in sort of what the complexity of what was happening. A really long time ago, we see shelled animals, very simple, snails, clams, those kinds of things. Then we start seeing fish appear. Then we start seeing amphibians appear, reptiles, mammals, birds, humans, right? So we do see this interesting trend in terms of complexity. More complex organisms came later in time. Not necessarily true with plants. Plants kind of have always been thriving. But regardless, we have these fossils, right, that tell us when things lived. And the interesting thing, too, is that I'm going to annotate here. Sometimes we actually see in the fossil record, we'll see a line like this, which means that an organism appeared here in the Pennsylvanian period and went extinct, right? So if we looked at this for all types of animals, we would see tons of these lines. I'm not that good at drawing straight lines, clearly. All over in different periods of time here, kind of showing where most species are extinct, right, that have ever existed. So we would see mostly lines that are not making it to modern day, right? This one's just happening to show lines that are. So regardless, what I'm trying to say here is fossils help us see which organisms lived when. And that is useful to us because this is actually the most words I've probably ever had on a slide. I know, but they're all important. So if you don't know what a fossil is, reminder, they're the remains of once living organisms, right? Usually the bones are the hard parts. So not every part of the organism can get fossilized. So some organisms can't produce fossils, right? Which is also a problem because then we can't really see them in the fossil record because if they don't have bones or any part of their body that's hard, for example, bacteria, right? We're not seeing bacteria in the fossils, even though there's probably thousands of them. And then we also, I said this already, but most fossils we find belong to species that no longer live on Earth, right? They've gone extinct. And then the kinds of fossils found in rocks at the different ages of Earth, found in rocks of different ages differ because life on Earth has changed over time. Right, so this is kind of how it supports evolution, that life has changed over time, and we see that in fossils. Pretty simple little summary there. All right, biogeographical evidence is Darwin type evidence here. So this is one of Darwin's most famous discoveries, these finches, right? In fact, I wonder if I have I don't think I brought it with me. I have his book on the origin of species, and I read it when I was in college, and it's really, really boring because back then science writing wasn't like technical and interesting. It was like, which I find interesting, it was all literary. It was like And then the bird flew slightly to the right and its wings expanded. And it was like really literary sounding. It was really hard to get through, but it was very interesting in terms of what he was suggesting. So what he suggested is that the Galapagos Islands, right, islands off of the coast of South America, there were all of these different types of finches there that have different beaks, right? And it's just one thing that was really different about them. So we can see here the different types of beaks that finches have, and they still have. We have the bigger beaks here that eat fruit. We have pointier beaks that eat grubs, which is like worms. We even have finches that can use tools, which is kind of scary. We have the finches that eat insects, the finches that eat leaves, and then the finches that eat seeds, right? And all the beaks are just slightly different. And Darwin was kind of like, how did they all get over here to these islands, right? There's no way that all these different types of finches flew over here from South America, because it's kind of far for a little tiny bird to fly. And I don't know if you've ever seen a finch, but they're like super high energy. They have to eat every 10 seconds basically because they burn so many calories. So what he actually hypothesized is that there was one finch originally, and that finch migrated to different islands and actually over time evolved to have these different types of beaks. And that basically it depended on what kind of food was available. If you have a seed-eating beak and the only food available to you is fruit, right, you can probably eat it, but it's harder. And then if you have a baby who has a slightly curved beak, just a mutation, right? Just like we have different hair colors, some finches are going to have a little bit of a different beak. Maybe that bird's able to eat even more, right? It's able to be super successful in the bird world, have multiple mates, reproduce a whole bunch. And possibly that trait gets passed on. And then more birds have this curved beak. And those birds are having an easier time eating, right? So it keeps on sort of adding up until eventually there's a whole community of these birds. So anyway, that's basically what Darwin's book was about. It was about his traveling and sort of observing these things in different situations. So this also has to do with location, right, in terms of the mainland versus islands. So organisms on islands are going to evolve separately from organisms on the mainland. So he also noticed when you went back to South America, you don't see any of these other kinds of finches. You just see the seed-eating finches, that's it. There's no variety. So those finches on the islands, one, they don't have any finches on the mainland like them, so they didn't migrate there, right? Even if they could, they wouldn't have been able to anyway. And two, there's so many different kinds now on these islands, and where did they come from? So organisms can come from a common ancestor, but migration to another part of the world can change their evolution, right? So as soon as these finches were in a different location with different food options, right, very slowly that changed how they actually physically look and function. All right, developmental biology. This is my favorite. This is one of my favorite courses ever in college because it's just really interesting to learn about how embryos develop. It's like insanely complicated. So many things could go wrong. So we see all these different animals here, right? And they're really tiny up here, but I'll read them out to you too. We have a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a chicken, a calf, and a human. So at the top, all these pictures here at the top, this is the earliest stage of development, right? And you notice they all kind of look exactly the same. You couldn't have told this was a human versus a chicken, for example. They look almost identical, right? Maybe the fish and the salamander don't have as many of these little lumpy things here. I don't know the technical term for them. But they look almost identical, right? And the second stage even, the salamander and the fish start to look a lot different. But look, the tortoise, the chicken, the calf, and the human looking pretty similar. right? Until finally we get much later in development and we can start to see subtle differences, right? For example, the beak on the chicken, the shell starts forming on the tortoise, the cow starts having like, I don't know, it looks like a cow face, and then human starts looking more human-like, right? So scientists were kind of like, that's strange. How come everything looks the same in the beginning? So that's one of the pieces of evidence here, right? That we kind of all had a common ancestor that developed a certain way. So all animals actually have gills when they're an embryo. So you as a human had gills when you were developing, right? Same with a calf. Those obviously go away so that you can be born and breathe in air. And then, of course, all vertebrates are going to have this thing called a notochord, which is the beginning of your spinal cord. It's basically like a thin, precursor to the spinal cord. And then every organism also has this post-anal tail. You'll notice here, every organism has these tails, right? And only in the later stage of development does it go away in humans. So that's pretty interesting, right? That all of these organisms would be so similar looking during development. So this is just a close-up of these features, right? We have these pharyngeal gills or pouches, which is actually how you breathe when you're in a sac of fluid, right? We have the notochord. My dog's probably gonna bark now. Maybe not. Okay. We have the notochord, and then we have a space where the nerve cord is actually going to develop. And then you can't really see it because of the picture camera thing here, but we also have the tail feature, right? We're actually going to talk more about this stuff, chordate. There's actually a group of organisms called chordata. We're going to talk about them in great detail later. All right, and then anatomy. This is one of the earlier pieces of evidence, right, where we look at the anatomy of different organisms, and we happen to see here a human, cat, whale, and bat limb. Yes, whales have limbs. So we don't need to read all this text here. This is like wordy stuff. But basically what we notice is that we have one big bone, two bones, a bunch of tiny bones, and then some kind of finger situation, right? And it's the same in all of these organisms. Even bats, one bone, two bones, finger bones. Same with whales, right? So again, common ancestor possibly that had this kind of structure. So it's plausible, right, that a slight gene mutation can give rise to the different proportions of the hands and feet. So for example, the whale has a mutation that causes its finger joints to be extremely long. The bat has a mutation causing its bones to be very thin and narrow, right? So it's possible that just one or two mutations could actually cause this many different shapes. Okay, and then there's our genetics evidence, which is our most recent kind of evidence. Remember, we didn't know about DNA until 1950s. Darwin proposed his origin of species concept in, I want to say the 1800s, I think it was. No one knew what DNA was. No one knew really anything about how organisms developed, right? So this is like the most cutting edge evidence here, which is one mutation can change an organism enough to produce more offspring. What that means is one mutation can make you better at living in your environment and therefore more likely to reproduce and survive, right? We say survive and reproduce because you have to survive in order to be able to reproduce. So just one mutation can actually do that, right? And we know from studying genetics that, some mutations don't do anything. Some mutations can change one thing. Some mutations can be lethal and kill an organism, right? So it's kind of a gamble there. But basically, one mutation is enough. And then, of course, we've talked about this before, but that how much DNA we have in common with other organisms. 45% of your DNA is identical to a yeast, 60% to a fruit fly, 95% to a rabbit, 98% to a chimp, right? So that's a lot of DNA to have identical and in common for these organisms. So the last thing, which I've also said before, right? A lot of times we see this picture of like monkeys becoming a human, right? And then there's even more modern ones where the human gets all slouched over at the computer, right? People trying to be funny. But basically, that is not how it happened, right? Humans do not come from monkeys. I like how it just says monkey on the screen. But these are just different types of apes, right? And essentially, we possibly had a common ancestor with modern day monkeys, but we split off one direction and they went a different direction, right? So don't necessarily believe everything you hear, right? Humans did not come from monkeys. That's not what evolution is trying to say. We are very similar to them though, 98%. So this brings up an interesting question, which you're actually gonna have to type in the chat. So there's a few interesting points about this, right? One is in South Korea, this is kind of an old article, I think it's from 2012 maybe. South Korea, which is a really Christian nation, they actually wanted to remove evolution from their textbook, right? If you're interested in reading the article, I can send it to you. It's really short. It's basically just some facts. But they were thinking about just completely removing it from the textbooks, not even having it taught at all in school. There's also this interesting survey, right, where 40% of Americans don't believe that humans evolved from less advanced forms of life. In Canada, there's 60% of people who don't believe that, and 80% in some European countries, right? So a lot of people not on board with evolution. So I want you to take a second to think about this concept, right? We really just went over what evolution is, the evidence is. If you've been working in the course, you've seen some of those things as well. So should evolution be taught in schools, right? Think about in America what you think should happen. So take a couple seconds, formulate a thought, type it in the chat, comment on other people if you would like. I'm gonna fill my coffee up and I'll be back. Oh, I really like Jacob's response here, because even if you choose not to believe in it, it is important to learn about it, and it is better to learn and believe than to believe the other side blindly without knowing anything about the other side, right? Without knowing the facts. I think that's so important, right? A lot of times people just hear that it's against their beliefs, so they just shut down and get freaked out and don't want to learn about it. Yeah, I think this is great. And you guys are really on this theory thing. So let me tell you something. You know what else is a theory? Or at one time was a theory? Gravity. I don't think anyone would deny that gravity exists, right? But gravity used to be a theory. So theory isn't just like someone thinks it. It means there's insane amounts of people thinking that, and there's tons of evidence for it. So it's a pretty big deal. It's not just someone's thought, right? Like I said, the difference is we haven't observed it happening, which makes it hard to make it a law. But a lot of scientists think that evolution will get to that point eventually. Yeah, I think you guys have really interesting answers here. All the ones that I've read, which was pretty much all of them, is basically like, yeah, we should learn about it. It doesn't mean you have to believe it. Some people are saying you should have a choice to learn about it. You know, and the nice thing is that, at least in terms of this course, right, it's really just in this one module, and then we're going to be done with it. So if, you know, if it's like driving you insane here, it's almost over. But really, I think most people hit it right on the head that you don't have to believe everything you learn in school, and hopefully you don't believe everything you learn in school. You should always be checking things that teachers are telling you or that you're learning, because, you know, some of them you might be like, oh yeah, that I understand and believe, right? But some things you should be questioning and wondering if that's really how it should be. So I think that's a really important part of it. You shouldn't just blindly accept everything that you learn in school. All right. So the last thing that we're going to do is, actually we can either watch this video together, or you can leave and watch it on your own, but you're going to have to wait for me to post it. But basically, there's this pretty short video. I forgot exactly how long it is, but it talks about the evolution of the whale. And, oh yeah, I did put it in the exit ticket. Thank you, Zach. You are right. I did put it up already. I'm on the ahead of the game here. In fact, I will show you. So a lot of people, I don't know if you read my email, but the 2/6 virtual session exit ticket, VS virtual session, right? That is maybe showed up on your due dates on Thursday or Friday. That is what we're going to be doing today after you leave the session. So when you open it, right, it says, using the information from the virtual session and the video below, complete the following. So there's a video here, and what you're going to do is, using the whale as an example, describe 3 pieces of evidence that support evolutionary theory, right? So you're just looking for 3 pieces of evidence that support the evolutionary theory, specifically about the whale. So we can watch the video together if you guys want, or we can end the session. I do also want to go over the confusing natural selection lab thing. Let's see where that is. That one was evolutionary relationships. I think that's what it was. And for those of you who are new and don't understand the misery that I experienced last semester, every time I tried to create exit tickets or labs like in the course, Canvas would delete them. So that's why everything is like in there now. So that's why the dates might not line up perfectly, but they're going to be close. All right, I have 1 vote for watching it together, 1 vote for watching it on our own time. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 things. If you want to leave the session in a second, you can. Let me just get an attendance here. Wow, this was actually a lot shorter than I thought it was going to be. Okay, I'm just going to take a screenshot here of everybody who's here. Let's see if I can get everyone. Such a long list. Okay, oops, and then missed 1 person. Okay. Whew. My super formal way of taking attendance, screenshots. Okay, so we will now say that the session is officially over. If you want to stick around, we're going to do 2 optional things that I'm also recording, so you can always come back and watch them later. We're going to watch the video together, right? And I'm going to go through this lab on evolutionary relationships that people had a hard time following the directions on because they're really strangely written. So if either of those things applies to you, you want to hear about the lab, or you want to watch the video, then you can stick around. Otherwise, feel free to leave the session, right? Watch the video on your own time and submit the ticket. So yep, you're good to go. Go ahead and leave if you don't need to do either of those things. All right, and thanks everyone who was able to come today. All right, so everybody else who's sticking around, we are gonna watch the video together, and then we will talk about that lab briefly, because I know some people might have already started it, maybe you haven't started it yet, but it is hard. Okay, so here is this video. What is the evidence for evolution is what it's called. Oh, of course, there's an ad. I miss the days when YouTube didn't have ads. Such good times. Why did it pause? Okay. Okay. I don't even know if you guys remember that time.
What is the evidence for evolution? The theory of biological evolution makes 2 very bold claims about living creatures. First, all living things on Earth are related. They evolved from a common ancestor. Second, the evolution of living things is powered by natural processes, things which can be studied and understood. But is there really any evidence that these 2 claims are true? Yes. There are so many observable facts from so many different fields of study that the only way we can even begin to talk about them is to group them into categories or lines of evidence. To keep things simple,
So you'll notice I didn't even go through all of these necessarily. We kind of talked about most of them, but he's going to talk about even more stuff than I talked about.
here we'll focus on evolution's first claim that all living things on Earth are related. We cannot tackle the entire tree of life at once. After all, there's an estimated 8.7 million species alive today. So instead, we'll focus most of our attention on one fairly small but fascinating branch of the evolutionary tree, cetaceans. This branch includes whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Biologists tell us that all these creatures are closely related and that the entire group evolved from an ancient 4-legged land mammal. Instead of taking their word for it, let's look at the facts. We'll start by looking at a few from the field of comparative anatomy, the study of differences and similarities between living things. Whales live in water, and from a distance, they sort of look like giant fish. A close inspection of their anatomy, however, tells us a very different story. Whales, just like land mammals but unlike fish, have placentas and give live birth. They feed milk to their young. They are warm-blooded, which is extremely rare for a fish. And whales do not have gills. Instead, just like us, they breathe air with 2 fully developed lungs. Whales don't seem to have noses like mammals do. Instead, they breathe through blowholes coming out the tops of their heads. Some whales have 2 blowholes which almost look like nostrils. But dolphins and porpoises only have 1. Surprisingly, if you look at their skulls, you find that the blowhole splits into 2 nasal passages inside the head. Could it be that the blowhole is actually a highly modified mammal nose? It looks that way, but we'll need more evidence to be sure. Many whales have hair, just like land mammals. In this photograph, you can actually see the whiskers of this baby gray whale as he rests his chin on mama's back. Strangely, whales have arm, wrist, hand, and finger bones inside their front flippers. Here's a photo of these bones, the same bones that bats, hippos, and people have in their front appendages. 1 bone, 2 bones, wrist, hand, and finger bones. Modern whales do not have back legs, but they do have a strange pair of bones where the hind legs should be. Here's a picture of these bones from a bowhead whale. They almost look like shriveled hip, thigh, and shin bones. This one even has a ball and socket joint between the hip and thigh bone, just like the ball and socket joint in your own hip. Is this resemblance a mere coincidence, or are these real leg bones? Perhaps leftovers from the whale's evolutionary history? Before we draw any bold conclusions, let's see if a completely separate line of evidence will confirm our suspicions. Embryology is the study of how creatures develop before being born or hatching from an egg. Here we see a dolphin and a human embryo side by side at similar stages of development. Notice that they both have what look like arm buds and leg buds. In humans, the leg buds grow to become legs. In whales, they grow for a while but then stop, effectively fading away as the rest of the whale continues to grow. These are all photographs of a common dolphin at different stages of growth. Notice that early on, we see two nostril grooves on the front of the face, just like you'd expect in a puppy or a human. As the dolphin continues to grow, the nostrils migrate to the top of the head and fuse together, becoming the dolphin's blowhole. So far, we have multiple facts from two independent lines of study, comparative anatomy and embryology, that are both telling us the same story. The ancestors of whales were once four-legged land creatures. Will the fossil record act as a third witness, confirming this idea? These are two species of extinct basilosaurid whales. These animals are known for multiple well-preserved skeletons, and they appear to have lived side by side, roughly 34 to 40 million years ago. In this photograph, we're looking down at the top of a basilosaurid skull. This is not a model or a cast. These are the actual bones which were pulled from the ground. Notice that the nasal opening is not on the top of the head like those of modern whales, and not at the end of the snout like those of land mammals. Instead, it's right in the middle. This is an intermediate species, exactly what evolution tells us we should find. At the back end of a basilosaurid's body, there are small, yet fully developed hips, legs, ankle, feet, and toe bones. These legs are far too small for walking on land, but they may have been useful while mating or for scratching away parasites and itchy skin. Evolutionary theory tells us that the further we go back in time, the harder it should be to distinguish whales from normal land mammals. Meet Myocetus. The hip bones of Myocetus seem sturdy enough to walk on land, but this animal is considered to be a whale for many reasons. Their skeletons have all been found among fossils of sea creatures, which tells us they lived in the ocean. Their short legs, combined with long, flat fingers and toes, suggest they were strong swimmers with webbed hands and feet. Here we see the bottom side of a Myocetus jaw and skull. Her teeth match those of the basilosaurid whales we saw earlier, and the unique structures of her middle ear bones match those of basilosaurid whales and modern whales. Myocetus appears to be a walking whale. Scientists have found the fossils of many ancient whale-like mammals and continue to find more. Together, these fossils blur the line between four-legged land mammals and fully aquatic modern whales, solidifying the idea that whales indeed evolved from land creatures. Now let's look at a fourth line of evidence, DNA. DNA molecules contain chemical codes which act like recipes for living things. Without ever looking at bones, embryos, or anatomy, researchers can compare the DNA code of different living creatures to find out who is most closely related to who. Whale DNA has been compared to all kinds of other animals, fish, sea lions, you name it. And so far, the closest genetic match is to the pudgy, water-loving hippopotamus. This does not mean that whales evolved from hippos, but if this genetic finding is correct, whales and hippos both evolved from a common ancestor that lived roughly 54 million years ago. At first, the link between whales and hippos surprised researchers because whales are mainly carnivores. They eat things like fish and small crustaceans. Hippos, on the other hand, are mostly vegetarian. A closer look, however, reveals that hippos
Although everyone knows hippos will kill you. They're really scary.
and whales actually share many strange features, some of which may have come from their common ancestor. Ancient walking whales have specially shaped ankle bones found only in hippos and the close relatives of hippos. Just like whales, hippos are known to give birth and even nurse their young underwater. They both have multi-chambered stomachs, which is common for herbivores, but is almost unheard of for meat-eating mammals. They are both missing a coat of fur, and here's a fun fact. Whales and hippos are among the only mammals on Earth that have internal testicles. So there you have it. 4 independent lines of evidence all tell us the exact same story. Whales evolved from 4-legged land mammals. But the history of whales is not the only evolutionary history that we've been able to work out. We know from fossils, DNA, embryology, and many other lines of evidence that bird wings are actually modified arms and claws. Birds evolved from dinosaur-like ancestors. We can also clearly see that bat wings evolved from 5-fingered hands, very similar to those of monkeys and shrews. We've found that humans share a fairly recent common ancestor with chimpanzees, that mammals evolved from reptile-like creatures. Those reptile-like creatures evolved from amphibian-like creatures. Those amphibian-like creatures evolved from fish-like creatures. And fish, if you go back far enough, share a common ancestor with segmented worms. So to sum things up, thousands of observable facts from completely independent fields of study have come together to tell us the exact same story. All living things on Earth are related. I'm John Perry, and that's a basic overview of the evidence for evolution.
Okay. So I really like that video because I think that guy does a really, really good job of explaining a specific trace in evolution. And oh yeah, people saying ad block. Actually, this is my work computer. I might not have ad block on this. I should get it. Or use a VPN. Look at you guys, all tech savvy. All right. Okay, so hopefully that helped you see to just
Stated.
A really specific line of evidence, right? Meaning really here that he's showing how the whale evolved. So what I want you to do is just describe 3 pieces of evidence that support evolutionary theory. So you could talk about the back legs of the whale, you could talk about the blowhole, etc. I just gave you 2. So for those of you who stuck around and got extra help and hints here. All right, other thing, let's talk about this weird lab. I just don't even, I'm gonna change this one for next year. All right, so in this lab, first of all, it's kind of labor intensive. You have to cut up all this paper. Feel free to downsize, right? Like do 20 pieces of paper total. That's fine. But you're gonna have to do some percentages then. You don't really need partners. You can do it by yourself, but you can have partners if you want. So the concept here is that you're taking a piece of fabric or, you know, a book or something like that to be your background. So for example, if I use this black scarf as my fabric, so I'm going to lay that down. Then you have to cut all this paper out, right? So you need 5 different colors of paper cut into 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter squares. Oh, you're supposed to have 100 squares of each color? Oh my gosh, I thought you were supposed to have 100 of total. Like I said, feel free to downsize to 100 total, to 20 total. But basically what you're gonna do is you're going to take all your papers that you cut out, you're gonna spread them all over your fabric, just randomly throwing them, spreading them out, laying them down. And then you're gonna make these predictions. If they were prey, which ones would most likely be eaten, right? If you have like a neon color, obviously it's gonna be easy to see on black. Do you have to do this lab if you're in the honors course? Yes, you do. So maybe like neon, like if I have this yellow Post-it note color, this is going to be easy to see. And then if I have black paper, it's going to be harder to see, right? So that's my prediction. So then basically what you're going to do is you're going to lay all the papers out. You're going to cover your eyes and you're just going to randomly select papers. Actually, I don't even think you have to cover your eyes. They don't even care about you covering your eyes here. You don't have to. You're just going to pick up, let's see how many squares you have to pick up. You need to collect 75 papers. So just grabbing them until you have 75. Then what you're going to do is count the number of survivors in each color. Right? So each surviving prey is going to have 3 babies. So let's say after I'm done, I've grabbed all my 75 squares, I have 25 left. Let's say I have 5 of each color. So I have 5 of the yellow ones, I have 5 black, I have 5 white, I have 5 blue, and 5 red, or something like that. Yeah, if you already did the lab, leave. Just I got a lot of questions about this. That's why I'm explaining it. So you're going to basically take each color and make it have 3 babies of the same color. So your yellow square will have 3 yellow babies. You're going to add them to the pile. Your red square will have 3 red babies. You're going to add those 3 until you're back up to 100 squares. That's what you're going to write for generation 1. So if you ended up with 5 of each, and they all have 3 babies, you're going to end up having 20 of each again. Right? But basically what you're writing for the generation is after they've had babies, then you're recording, which is kind of confusing. And it's also weird because it's like colored papers having babies, etc. So really the issue here is spreading them out, picking up 75, having the ones that are left reproduce, recording however many there were, and then grabbing 75 again. Whatever's left reproduces. Record how many are there. Pick up again, right? So you're going to do that 3 times. Essentially, what should happen is your dark colored squares or your squares that are blending in with your background, those are going to be hopefully the ones that survive. Because as you're just grabbing randomly, right, it's going to be a lot easier for you to grab the squares that you can see really well. So you should see, which you might not, which we'll talk about why in a second, you should see that the ones that blend in with your background are surviving more. Now, this may not happen, right, because this is kind of a difficult process to mimic. Essentially, what they want you to see in this lab is that if you possess a characteristic that helps you blend in with your environment, you're going to survive, right? So you might think about like that each piece of paper is a deer, and you are a coyote hunting the deer. Do coyotes eat deer? They're going to eat deer in our scenario. So you have your deer, you have your coyote, that's you, right? You're eating the deer, and the deer that are super light colored and easy to see are going to be the ones that get eaten versus the ones that are blending in. That's really what they want you to get out of this lab. It is confusing the way they wrote it. If you have a question about it personally, just email me because you might want me to write it out in text. I can also do that. But yeah, so then creating a graph and then answering these conclusion questions. But essentially, right, there's many things missing here because if you're a predator hunting prey, right, the color that they are is not the only trait they have, right? We don't know about how fast the deer are, right? If they're sick and maybe they're laying down, they're easy to prey on. We don't know about the weather conditions, right? If it's like snowing, for example, my dog just fell off the couch. That might change what's going to happen, right? So there's a lot of factors here that are not being thought of. And also it's hard because natural selection isn't supposed to be a conscious action. And here you are consciously selecting. And that's not really how it works. So it's the best way to kind of represent it. On Valentine's Day, we're going to do the Skittles lab. It's a little simpler, but it does involve this kind of confusing thing where like each Skittle is reproducing, which is weird, but you got to have the reproduction in there for it to work. All right, so spread out your squares, select 75, let those ones that are left over reproduce. They each have 3 babies, and then record how many are there for generation 1, and then select 75 again. That's pretty much the process. Okay. Otherwise, please email me if you have questions about that lab, because it is really confusing. And other than that, we are done. So I'm gonna end the recording here. Thanks for those of you who stuck around till the end, and I'll talk to you soon.